kit one of these is double-sided with project 2, which would be 19 and 21. And remember, we had 20 and 22 as a filler. So you were told last week not really to worry about that because of my family situation. Project 3 will be the implant, starting the implant project. And so we will begin some of that today. We will begin with generating your cast if you did not do that for your surgical guide. We are limited by only being able to get to the point of fabricating the actual template. We do not have the monomer for the OrthoJet acrylic yet. The other hiccup is the hood is non-functional to my understanding. It may be as simple as plugging it in and having a little instruction on how to function, but I was told that not to try and plug it in and use it myself. So that is where we are with that. Because as you remember, I'll recall I said that I do not want 75 people working with monomer out in the open lab. We will all have a very bad day, even though the ceilings are high. Okay? So your goal today would be to get through to project 2, which most of you should be very close, if not done with that, and get that signed off on your form. It's double-sided. So on the other side is your implant project. So please do not lose the sheet. All right? You will need to turn this in before your competency, so that I know that you've done what you needed to do. Speaking of which, our schedule right now is off magically only by 1 week. So while I will try and get that updated and get that posted for you so that you understand that. So we will very likely not have a competency as scheduled just before your tablet week. It will be after that week. That competency will be your implant project, which should be fun, okay? Yeah, so that's what we're looking there. And hopefully that will not conflict with, I think, midterm, when everyone else typically tries to do midterms. I think most people trying to do the week before tablets. Whatever the week, I think the week of after is that first week in October, like the 3rd or somewhere around there. So our competency would be like the 9th, 10th, no, the week after. I don't know what the dates are right off the top of my head, but I just great the first week after and the week after. Because then that gives you another full week to complete anything outstanding. Your other option would be if you would rather do a preventative competency instead of the implant competency. So that's something that you might want to think about. I will allow you to do that. You might feel more comfortable doing that. But most students enjoy the implant project a whole lot more so than the usual. Repeat which one. You could have the option of doing prepare 2 abutments and make provisional as your first competency. I would not advise that, but if that's what you would like to do, you have more practice with that. Something to think about. And Ashley could probably give a poll and you all could figure that out. I'd like for you to at least give it 2 weeks before you make that decision, get through the implant parts. Okay? And for the implant competency, you would not have to do the entire project. I would just be asking you to make a final impression and create another provisional restoration. So I would give you a whole new temporary abutment and have to make a whole new provisional restoration, which is a little bit less time consuming and more fun if it were me, but it's up to you. Okay? All right. Are we clear as mud for now? Yes? Okay. So I am speaking a little bit lower. My throat is not in the best condition, so just kind of bear with me. I'm just going to have to stay right here because I can't move and breathe. So we have talked about implant components, parts and pieces, correct? We have talked about how to plan for your surgical placement, and that as the restoring dentist, you are the quarterback. You determine where that implant goes based on how you want your definitive restoration to turn out. Where it's occlusal, incisal contact, aesthetics, all of those wonderful things. So once the surgeon has utilized your lovely surgical guide and placed the fixture exactly where you wanted it, the patient is then going to go through osseointegration, which could range anywhere from 3 to 6 to 9 months, depending on the quality and placement of the bone in either the maxillary or mandibular arch. So you've allowed for that fixture to osseointegrate, and the surgeon then uncovers it to uncover the cover screw. At that point, now we're ready for our restorative procedures. So you will have, and have already done this, you have diagnostic impressions of your patient, you have mounted that and waxed it up to determine where you want your restoration to develop from the soft tissue and the alveolar bone. You are then going to duplicate that, and we're going to begin the process of making a surgical guide and having the implant placed. You're allowing for fixture integration, and again, that timeline can be from 3 to 6 to 9 months, and it is dependent upon the quality of the bone and which arch it goes into. Clearly, you should remember from anatomy that the maxillary arch has more porous bone. We have other anatomical limitations, such as the sinus, that could dictate where and how many, and the size and length of the implant that we could place, versus the mandibular arch, other than nerve, placement or nerve anatomy, neural canals. You pretty much can place an implant just about anywhere, right? So now we're ready to think about our restorative procedures. And just a review. So the osseointegration is time dependent, and I just reviewed that, and the magical number that you receive on a test question could be from 3 to 6 to 9 months, somewhere in that range. You're going to uncover the implant fixture, and that's what that would look like. What you were looking for is, if it would be lovely if the tissue were that pink. This is several weeks or maybe a month or so after uncovering, because the tissue would actually be pretty bloody if we uncovered it, right? Because they either punch or do an actual flap. But you would want to be able to see that platform of the fixture, and you can even notice that it has a golden hue, right? So that tells you that it's a certain dimension. We're not worried about those dimensions, but at least you know that if you see that yellow color, when you go to the order form, you do not need to try and mix colors. You don't go with green. You don't go with magenta pink. You look at the line that has the golden yellow on it, okay? That means it's a regular platform fixture, right? We are also looking for the tri-channels that at least one lobe be in direct buckle, not in some off orientation. If it is in between direct buckle and maybe towards the mesial or towards the distal, you are very likely looking at something that you're going to have to order a custom abutment. So now your price has just gone up for you and the patient, okay? So this is just a representation of uncovering. Final impression procedures. So, ideally what we're trying to do is just capture this position in our patient so that we have a working cast. It should capture all of the hard and soft tissue. So if you're thinking, oh, well, I got the anterior 6, I don't need the posterior molars, you are wrong. You need all of the hard and soft tissues. Not like for a removable prosthesis, we don't need the turns and all of that, but you at least need to have all of the occlusal and incisal surfaces of the teeth and 3 to 4 millimeters beyond that point. If it's a maxillary implant or procedure, you could actually use a mandibular tray and just capture that arch. You don't necessarily need the hard cavity, okay? So that's something to think about. It's important. If you don't start off with all of your appropriate diagnostic information, you're building your case on half of the information. So you're going to have a half length terms as restoration, which we do not want people paying for, right? Right? Come on, I'm the one that's not feeling well. That's all y'all got is that, right? All right, your components. This should be a review. This is important to make sure you understand what the parts are and what they need. We are going to utilize a transfer impression post system. I don't need for you to think about anything else. I don't want to hear about anything else. Just transfer impression post for the Nobel system. That is what you're being introduced to. Next year, you will utilize a different system that has a different type of impression procedure. It's all a matter of what's going to work for your particular case and for your patient. So it's not always one technique that you can use. We're starting with the most simple, okay? You screw the parts together, you transfer them from one part to the other, and it's done. Minus a couple of details. We'll get into that in a second. All right, so this is going to capture the image of the impression, but leaves the post within the patient's mouth, okay? So you're going to make an impression, you're leaving that post there, you have to physically unscrew it and put a healing cap back on. Just hold tight, work with it. You're going to utilize the implant analog to connect to the impression post, right? Everyone has one of those, right? What is that going to look like? So, the cover screw is removed once we are uncovering the implant. You're going to connect your impression post. Something to note here, timing is important. So after we've uncovered our fixture, typically you could wait anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to let tissue kind of heal. Then you can begin your impression procedures. Once we take off that healing abutment, you don't take the healing abutment off, turn around, go collect $200, and expect that you're going to be able to place the impression coping or impression post into that tissue without pinching the patient. Now, while we don't have a tooth there, those soft tissues are still innervated, and most patients describe that as, oh, that pinches. You can see this clinically by noticing that the tissues will blanch white. They will lose their coral pink color and will blanch white. So what you want to do is time the removal of your healing abutment. You're taking that out very quickly. It frequently looks very disgusting, may have granulation tissue underneath if that has loosened. In that event, you may need to do an additional soft tissue punch to remove tissue tags so that you can get your impression coping all the way down. Does that make sense? And again, your patient would indicate that you have soft tissue trapped underneath by saying, ouch. Or you would see the tissue or you will see the tissue blanch. And they would be typically white, okay? So what does that look like? Here's an example of 2 fixtures that are placed with healing abutments. The tissue looks very nice and coral pink. And you can even see how for the magenta fixture, how those tissues kind of look. You can't even see the whole platform, right? So you can see in a matter of time, those tissues are just not magically staying away. They start to slump as soon as you remove that healing abutment.
Is that tissue hole blanch you were talking about, is that something that you do immediately upon uncovering?
So you cannot do it. So in real life, yes, that's something that you would probably want to try and do. In our realm, that means that you put the healing abutment back on and you get the patient over to perioral surgery and have them to do it.
So would that be after waiting 2 or 3 weeks after you remove that? So
yeah. Whatever you need to do to move the tissue out of the way so that you can get your impression. So that is 1 or 2 things. Either you're going to do an additional punch, which usually solves the problem, and for our purposes, if you need to do that here at the School of Dental Medicine, you're going to take your impression coping with you, and as soon as they punch, you're going to go ahead and put your coping there so that you can get your impression. Okay? Or you could decide to wait, make sure it's nice and tight. The healing abutment is nice and tight, and try and maybe wait another two weeks or so. Because it's no fun trying to make an impression with, hemorrhaging tissue. At least in my mind. I don't know how anyone else might feel about that. It is not fun at all. And unfortunately, unlike a natural tooth, using viscostat or something like that is just not going to help you. Okay? No, you cannot. You do not do that. Because, I'll show you just 1 minute. That is significantly longer than the occlusal plane, so that patient would not be able to close down. Okay? At best, if you're not able to get an impression at that point, you put the healing abutment back in. Okay? It's a good question. So shows your thinking. I appreciate that. Okay, so here's what it looks like once we've uncovered, but we're not going to wait for us to collect $200 to try and get our impression coping on, because those tissues will slump and move. So here are your respective impression posts. And the easiest thing that I would, or the manner that I would suggest that you manage this is, what you want to try and do is line up these tri-lobes, so you're going to get this portion of the impression coping, the tri-lobes, to seat all the way down before you start screwing the screw down, turning the screw down. If you begin by just kind of getting the impression coping oriented on the fixture and begin to screw down, you will not have intimate connection. And our goal is to have an intimate connection. And believe it or not, if you're thinking, oh, I mean, there are two screw parts, how hard can it be? It can be hard, and it is challenging sometimes, particularly if you're in the posterior maxilla and you can't see, and your hands are bigger than mine, because sometimes my hands are too big and it just can't function.
You use like rubber band when you're doing this, and it seems to be the easy job for these
Yeah, that's you could use I guess you could use a rubber dam if you wanted to, but you just have to use a throat pack. Of course, your patient is not reclined all the way back. I know that Dr. Love loves the rubber dam. I am not a fan of the rubber dam. It's going to take me an hour and a half to get it on, and by that time I could have gotten 3 impressions. So whatever you think is going to work for you, Dr. is shaking his head. I mean, it's going to take you more time to try and be safe. So you just have to be able to utilize your time wisely. So throat pack, patient is on the halfway recline, and you're using, an assistant who's helping you to, and you're keeping your eye on it, And so luckily these things are long, they're color coded, that helps, but you're right, once you get, gloves on, saliva, things get slippery when wet, so that is not a good feeling when you've had someone to swallow on and you're praying that it goes down the right tube. So that's no fun, and I've had that happen exactly twice, so. That and a button screw, so and those are even tinier. So this is what this is going to look like. And again, what I said is what your technique should be is to make sure that the color-coded sheet or post of the impression coping is engaged and down first, and you're going to allow the soft tissue. Remember what I said, if the tissue is pliable or moving, you're going to allow that portion of the coping to seat first, allow the soft tissue will initially blanch, and then with time, as the tissue adjusts to the width of that impression coping, it will pink back up, come back to color. Then at that point, you should begin to tighten your screw down with the hex driver, okay? For our purposes, you do not have a hex driver, you're just going to use finger pressure, okay? And believe it or not, this can be challenging. I'll show you how it can be challenging. And I want you to make note of, we all know that this top portion is hex-like, but you notice that there is something covering that area. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Once we introduce that into the oral cavity, it is important that you make sure anytime that you're working with implant component parts, you should always take a radiograph to verify that it is seated all the way. Again, it's not so simple that you're just screwing something to place. You have to make sure there's an intimate connection. This is what that connection should look like. Although this is a horrible radiograph, you do not see a space in between those component parts. Okay? It also gives you a record of what the bone height is. So I do not recall about how long this particular implant was placed and when we were beginning restorative procedures, but at least now we have a record of where the bone height is when we're beginning our restorative procedures. So we already know that we have a couple of threads that are not covered with bone. So that's something that you want to make note of. So that within our year or 6-month recall, if we have more bone loss, that's something that we need to take a step back and evaluate. Okay? And so our goal is then to use a monophase material, unlike what is pictured here. We do not use light in heavy body or light in medium body. We are only trying to capture the relative position of the component parts. you only need to do that with a monophase material. Okay, not a light body material, because that will run everywhere. You will capture way too much detail, which we do not need for machine parts. We just need to capture the relative position of these particular components. And you can do that by just syringing the material around each impression coping and then introduce the rest of the material in the tray. So you're going to use your Aquasil, just the purple material. That is it, right? Once you make your impression, you're then going to remove your impression coping from the patient's oral cavity, and you would place the healing abutment back on, right? Now, your lab work begins. You're going to take that impression coping, you're going to screw it into the analog, and then you reintroduce the analog impression coping complex back into the impression. What is important is that before you make that impression, if you fail to block out the top of the hex screw, you're going to have a positive in the impression, right? If you have a positive in the impression and you go to try and place the entire complex back in, you may not be able to verify that it's fully seated. While it is an elastomeric impression material, you may get lucky and get the hex in the right position, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to be off by a millimeter. Now that alters the placement or position that you capture of your fixture, which is enough of an error to screw you up. So, and it's too far down for you to even think about trying to, oh, I can just cut that out. No, you cannot. Did you have a question or are you stretching?
Both. Are you just covering that with...
Which one is it? Okay. Oh.
Are you just covering the tops of that with wet
Yes,
paper towel?
just the top.
With,
And you can just use wax, you can use PBS, something quick. Again, it should not be a brain surgical procedure, right? Something you can swipe and move real quick, right? And you want to make sure that you see whatever it is once you take your impression. If it's back in the impression, now you've still got the same problem. So it's relatively something that's going to stay within that hex driver hole, okay? And that's important. That's a critical step. That's one critical step before you make your impression. The second critical step would be radiographic confirmation that your component is seated all the way. And that's always important when you're doing any type of implant procedures. So we have this lovely complex. And so what do we think the answer is to this? Do we freak out? Do we ask our classmate? Do we ask our friend in the cubicle next to us who knows less than you? You know that's what you do, right? This person is knowing full well that they don't know. They know less than you. So you've got to breathe and you remake it, right? Because again, if you do not have all of the information that you need in that single impression, then you are starting off your case from crap. And that's not a good one. And so I'm not going to apologize for the use of words, but trying to emphasize that that's not what you want to do, okay? All right. I think, yes. So we are going to start on at least getting to the point, getting your cast, a solid cast, so that you can make a bioform. We're going to distribute the material for you to make a bioform and get the material or guide cut back to where it should be. As noted on the presentation from last week, there are at least 6, there might be 8 machines downstairs. So faculty are going to be positioned. There's at least 4 of us here, 4 or 5 of us here will be positioned next to the machine. Please be mindful that after about 5 or 6 people have used it, all of those elements will be hot. So I ask that you please be careful. We have had students to get 2nd-degree burns on their palm of their hands or backs of their hands because those components are very hot. So please be mindful. So with that being said, you can try and get this done today, between today and next week. Okay, because what I don't want is for people to be panicked. And once you kind of get a general idea as to how to use the machine, then the faculty can help you get it all set up. that you can do it all on your own. Just be mindful, be careful. I am, however, only going to distribute one piece of BioCryl at this point. And starting next week, if you have messed something up, which it does sometimes happen, then I'll distribute a little bit more. I'll let Ashley know where we can get some more. Okay? I have enough to do that, but I always want you to try to screw up once. This is impossible. Okay? And then in the interim, if you're waiting, let's at least try and connect those component parts on your patient. You are going to need to lubricate what we rigged your analog in your patient now. Lubricate that with Vaseline, please, just lightly, and then we would like for you to attempt one impression today, between today and next week. Okay? Then your other third thing would be to make sure that at least project 2, which would be 19 and 21, gets checked off. That's what you need to make sure you do. Secondly, on project 3, the faculty should be able to see your wax-mounted diagnostic cast and a wax-up, which I know everybody has, right? Yes. So that needs to, so you need to make sure that that gets done by next week, please. By next week, please. Okay? And then we are striving to be able to complete final impression and pretty much so finish surgical guide by next week, pending that we have ortho resin to function with and instructions on a hood that may or may not be functional other than taking up space. Are they? Yes, ma'am.
We're only doing surgical back for 8.
Yes, just one, because it's easy right in front. So the faculty should see your, just like the presentation outlines, the removal of that tooth, X marks the spot, your little divot, all of that stuff, okay? So that's the point you want to get to, other than trying to utilize the acrylic, okay? And that shouldn't take very long at all. That's not a long procedure at all, okay? Okay, any other questions, silly or otherwise?